In our last hint, we looked at the concept of the recessionary gap using the aggregate supply and demand model. In this hint, we're going to look at the same situation, the recessionary gap, but now we will use the multiplier model. We're going to start with this framework where the x-axis is y for income, the same as it was in our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, but our y-axis is different. Now we have aggregate expenditures and aggregate production. Observe this 45-degree line. We can think of that as the aggregate production line, and it is simply showing that aggregate production is always equivalent to aggregate income. That is our basic equality that we've talked about. In other words, when we create value by producing something, we generate the same amount of income, whether in wages, rent, interest, or profit, as the value of that product created. So production value is always going to be equal to total income. So that's what this line represents. So we're going to find that all equilibria in this model have to occur along this line because that is a basic identity in the economy and must be met. Now what we're going to add to this diagram is the AE, okay, which stands for aggregate expenditures. AE equals aggregate expenditures. And that is going to start at some point on the y-axis, because even when income is zero, we would have to have some spending or we would not be able to sustain ourselves. And then it rises with income. So as we get additional income, we spend a good portion of that. Presumably, we do not spend all of it because we will save some of it. We can also have leakages in terms of imports or taxes, but for right now, we'll just think of the consumption part of it. So whatever income we don't consume, we save. So that means that the aggregate expenditures line is going to look something like this. We can now see where our equilibrium point is going to be, and that is going to be where the aggregate expenditures line crosses the aggregate production line, or this point right here. So let's go ahead and put a big dot there, and we're going to now label that YE. Okay, that's my equilibrium income. Now the question is going to become, is this a desirable equilibrium income? And again, as we have in prior material, we're going to try to establish for ourselves what we think YP is, where YP, if you recall, was potential income. So that's where unemployment is, really as low as we can realistically get it. And in this example, we're going to presume that YP is located to the right of this YE. So we would put it in here. And notice that YP is higher than YE, and we can label this distance between the two as the recessionary gap. This is the same concept that we saw in prior material. So since this Y is actually a dollar value, of course, then if we took the YP value in dollars and subtracted the YE value, we would get a dollar amount for the recessionary gap. So if we simply draw a vertical line at YP, and I'll label this YP, it's going to feel very much like the long-run aggregate supply curve from our prior diagram, aggregate supply and aggregate demand diagram. And indeed, it will function in much the same way. If we look along the YP value here, what we will see is that at YP, the aggregate expenditures function that we have implies that expenditures, is going to be less than aggregate production, which we read from the 45-degree line. So production is higher than spending. So that means that all of the production value being created is not being spent. This means this cannot be an equilibrium. Because production is higher than spending, inventories will build up. Inventories building up means that firms will cut back on their production. As they cut back on production, they will also be cutting back on the income that they create, and of course we go back to this equilibrium income. So you see that YP is not going to be attained with this aggregate expenditures curve the way it is. Now at this point, we just want to recall that in the multiplier model, we are holding the aggregate price level, P, constant. We are not allowing that to vary. And unlike the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, where we could take two different perspectives on eliminating the recessionary gap, the classical and the Keynesian, this model really only allows us to show the Keynesian perspective. So we just want to keep that in mind. So what we're going to do next is we're going to actually draw a new aggregate expenditures curve, which will allow us to eliminate the recessionary gap and arrive at YP, potential income. And just noting here, this is where we're trying to get to, right? This is where YP intersects the aggregate production line. So that's the one we're trying to get to. So what we're going to have to do is shift aggregate expenditures up by an amount which allows us to hit that intersection point. So I'm going to label that AE prime, and we can think of this as a actual horizontal shift up. And the other thing to note here is that a shift of this size allows us to then achieve an increase in income that is this size, right? The size of the recessionary gap. So a relatively smaller shift in aggregate expenditures ends up generating a bigger shift in income. And of course, that's because of the multiplier effect, which we have seen before. You saw that in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand diagram, but it wasn't as clear. Here you can literally see that the ratio of this income shift divided by this initial shift, that ratio is the multiplier. That's the value for the multiplier. Okay? And in a separate hint, I will put some numbers to this, but I wanted you to just get a feel for how this whole graph framework in the multiplier model works. And just one final comment. Perhaps you can think, what would be the case if we had YP to the left of YE? So if YP was over here, that would actually generate a distance there, which would be the inflationary gap, and that, in terms of policy, would require a shift not up in the aggregate expenditures curve, but down. And that lower aggregate expenditures function would generate an equilibrium that would occur so that we reached the lower potential income figure.